Hello, good morning, everybody. Excuse me. My name is Ebrahim Moosa, and I am a professor of Islamic Studies in the Keough School of Global Affairs. And I also teach a class on integral human development and global affairs. And I'm also joined by Dr. Rashid Omar and his class on peace building and peace studies, who's also joined us here today. It is my very, very distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Obaidullah Baheer to Notre Dame today. Professor Obaidullah teaches at the American University of Afghanistan, where he's a lecturer. In our publicity, we already gave him a doctorate, but he's just completed his master's at the University of New South Wales. He writes with such flourishing and accomplishment. I thought he's a super prof already. So, but I'm really, really grateful that he's here today. You know, the tragic events in Afghanistan for more than 4 decades requires an innovative approach, in my view, and a careful understanding of the issues that are not decided in Washington, London, and Berlin. And therefore, Professor Obaidullah Baheer brings to us a very unique perspective, different from perspectives elsewhere, that you will, unfortunately, you will not hear those perspectives in our policy deliberations. Neither will you hear that in the way our media talks about that, or nor will you find these kinds of voices being substantial parts of the conversation, even in academia. There might be 1 or 2 voices that is just brought in there to appease some people, but it will be appeasement strategy, but it is not substantial into the conversation, the way we think about conflict and conflict resolution and global affairs. So, but more importantly, why I wanted him here today, and he's here visiting the new school in New York, is that I wanted to hear the voice of Afghans and an Afghan person of his stature who live inside Afghanistan, because these voices are absolutely absent in any serious deliberation. You know, what is happening in our country, and for those of my students in global affairs and so on, is that these issues of global affairs, and now we have a war happening in Ukraine, these issues are decided in kinds of binaries. In 2001, it was the axis of evil, you know, it is us versus them. Now it is about democracies versus autocracies. And these issues make these things into kind of abstract ideas. But what we forget, that these democracies and autocracies involve humans. There are people living in there. And when we decide that we're going to bomb this autocracy or destroy this society because of some reason, we are killing human beings. And integral human development, which is this one major plank of our course, talks about the human person in its full complexity, and that human person is not labeled as a democrat or as an autocrat, but has a certain dignity that we should be concerning. So I'm really, really concerned about the way in which we talk about global affairs by putting on labels and nationalities on people, that we create enemies through that. Professor Baheer is an expert of peace and reconciliation and was recently featured in The Australian as one of 5 prominent Afghans who refused to leave their country despite the Taliban takeover. He also leads an aid effort titled Save Afghans from Hunger. He makes his voice heard by publishing frequently in the Washington Post, The Economist, and The Guardian, and by giving talks, teaching, and advising, as he's doing here today. What I was really impressed is when I looked at his bio and some of the pieces that he sent, that in August of 2021, days after the Taliban took Kabul on 15th of August, he published around 20th of August an op-ed piece in The Economist. And the opening lines go like this: when Kabul fell on Sunday, my father, that is his father, went on live television to congratulate the Taliban on their glorious victory. He writes, as I watched him praise the jihadists, my phone buzzed with panic messages from friends who were terrified that Taliban fighters would kill them in their homes. Professor Obaidullah writes, I was brought up to hate the West and everything it stood for. My grandfather, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, was one of Afghanistan's most prominent mujahideen, that is, the mujahideen who fought the Soviets before the mujahideen were removed from power by the Taliban. He says, I'm a lecturer in politics at the American University of Afghanistan, specializing in conflict resolution. I have friends who are journalists, activists, and academics. I care about those who are now in hiding or scrambling through gunfire to board planes. Over the course of my life, I have learned to shuttle between the two Afghanistans. Now they are staring each other face to face, and no one knows what the outcome will be. He writes, during the 1980s, my grandfather commanded thousands of fighters who had taken up arms against the Soviet Union when it occupied Afghanistan. Initially, the CIA supported his troops, but he still regarded Americans as godless imperialists who oppress Muslims, end of quote. To inform us more about the grave situation in Afghanistan, he highlighted the dire situation in an op-ed in the Washington Post last November. He wrote, a local security guard down the road where I live in Kabul was recently forced to sell his wedding band to feed his family. He hasn't gotten paid in months, but he hopes he might get what he's owed soon. Another man tells me he buys old bread from the bakery at a discount. It's the only thing his family will eat over the next 2 days. Sign up for a weekly roundup of thought-provoking ideas and debates. Stories of desperation are everywhere in Afghanistan. The roads are lined with possessions as families try to sell what they can to get much-needed cash. In rural areas, a drought has decimated crops, and the weakened purchasing power is also drying up demand for goods and livestock. According to a report co-led by the United Nations World Food Programme and Food and Agriculture Organization, he writes, nearly 19 million Afghans, or 45% of the population, are experiencing high levels of food insecurity. He says, for many people like me, this has meant switching from political activism to humanitarian work. We are working constantly to provide food rations for families in need. The obscene hunger and poverty are heartbreaking, and the international community must understand the urgency of the situation, end of quote. And as you know, the Biden administration has decided to take Afghanistan's wealth and decide how they're going to distribute it to their favorite pet projects in different places in this country and in Afghanistan. So I'm really, really grateful and really, really honored and privileged that you are here today, Professor Obaidullah Baheer, who will talk to us on the topic Afghanistan after the war, before the peace. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Obaidullah Baheer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moosa, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for being here. Let's just start with something provocative, right? I think that's interesting. It'll wake everyone up and hopefully get you to join the conversation, because I intend to have a lot of that with you people in this class. I've had friends beheaded by the Taliban. I've had the Taliban shoot at me. I've had to shuttle back and forth between the country because of security concerns. That being said, I want reconciliation. I want a sustainable future for my country. Because what I see now is, I grew up watching these mega concerts that were organized for Africa, and they had a theme that said every 3 seconds a child dies in Africa from hunger. The number that was mentioned of starving people in Afghanistan has since then multiplied. We are approaching a 30 million population that is starving from hunger. This is not Ukraine. This is not an outside country invading and people having to get displaced. This is a man-made crisis. This is a crisis of starving people. I have seen children who are wasting. The worst type of starvation is called wasting, when your own body eats itself up. I have seen those children, and they are a result of the policies that the world chooses with regards to Afghanistan, right? So here in this conversation, I want to give you a quick overview of what the status quo is in Afghanistan. And there are a few very important fundamental questions that need to be asked. And that is, how do we see the Taliban? How do we see an entity that we have engaged with in conflict for 20 years, an entity that does not see eye to eye with us on a lot of issues? And it's really important because a recording recently resurfaced of a very important member of the Taliban movement. He was narrating to a group of families of suicide bombers, telling them that when the Taliban had attacked a hotel in Kabul in 2011, the fighters called him mid-attack. Now, mind you, this is an attack in which they killed dozens of innocent people. And one of the fighters called the leader and say, we see the Prophet leading this attack for us, right? And this is not to mix in religion with this, but I want to show you the amount of conviction that the people we are dealing with hold, to an extent when you believe in your cause to such an extent that you will see the Prophet of your religion not only supporting your actions, but actually leading them for you, right? So just to keep that in mind. So we'll do a quick recap of what has happened in Afghanistan. Then we're going to talk about the very unpleasant status quo that we have. And beyond that, we will ask the important question of how do we view the Taliban now? Are they friend or foe? And is that binary sensible to hold considering the current circumstances? Then we're going to talk about what is it that conscientious or people with conscience can do in response to such a movement being in power. And lastly, we'll talk about the long-term vision that people like myself and others have for the country and how we're ever going to achieve something more sustainable. So what happened was we saw in February of 2020, the United States decided to engage with the Taliban as a group in Qatar. Negotiations were started. It's really funny because the first time the United States delegation chose to meet the Taliban, before they walked into the room, Trump tweeted that he was going to withdraw from Afghanistan one way or the other. Basically, the United States team walked into that meeting with zero leverage. Now, then if you look at the actual agreement that was signed, it was in other ways recognizing the Taliban as a government in waiting, which gave them the legitimacy that they required at the cost of the legitimacy of the Afghan Republic that the United States had supported for 20 years. And we saw Taliban delegations travel around the world, meeting different countries. 5,000 of their fighters were released as part of that agreement, the same 5,000 fighters that went back to fighting and increased their military capacity. And the result was a blitzkrieg from the Taliban's part in which they took over all of Afghanistan in 11 days. And obviously, this is not to say that the United States is the sole party to be blamed for the outcome that we saw, but we will keep distributing the blame as we go on. Then on the other end, we saw the problems with the Republic. For the past 4 or 5 years, the idea of a reconciliation with the Taliban was floating. The Taliban, this wasn't the first time the Taliban showed intent of wanting to reconcile. Months after the United States intervention in Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban communicated with the Afghan representatives and with the US administration that they were willing to sign a peace agreement in which they will cease their military operations and exist as a political entity. The United States outrightly refused to engage in such negotiations, saying, we don't negotiate with terrorists. 20 years later, that statement changed, right? That being said, the Republic for years refused to engage honestly in a reconciliation process. They saw the reconciliation process as an existential threat to their existence, and because one of the problems is when you and I have a conflict between us, normally it's about disputed goods. And those studying peace would know that very often it's that disputable good that is the bane of the conflict. And then we start talking about when we get to a stalemate and we figure out that peace settlements are the only way forward, we decide to divide that good. The problem with religion being involved in this equation makes that goods indivisible. What does that mean? That means it pushes us into a binary world where the system can either be secular or it can be religious, right? It cannot be a mix of both. So there isn't a compromise that is logical for both sides to make. So there was a lot of dishonesty to the peace process on the Afghan Republic's part. And then there was horrendous military strategy, which led to losing the one advantage that they had. They ended up tactically retreating from their rural areas and garrisoning within the urban centers, which is, if you ask a 5-year-old where they would have an advantage of fighting an insurgency, they would tell you in open fields rather than in closed-up cities. So they lost that advantage. They lost their aerial advantage that they could have had within the rural areas. All of those things led to the quick collapse of the regime. There was also the problem of rampant corruption within Afghanistan. Afghanistan was constantly ranked as the top 5 most corrupt regimes in the world within the past decade, which meant that the fighters who were expected to die protecting these political entities refused to do so and chose to abandon post when it came to the actual eventual fight. But one of the major problems, and this is something we are still feeling the aftershocks of, is whenever a peace settlement happens, it's a better outcome. Why? Because it merges a lot of the different ideologies into a more sustainable system, right? There are always going to be tensions, but at least it accommodates opposite thought. Now, when military takeovers happen, the problem is that you create single actor models where you push everyone who is not you out of the political sphere. And that happened very naturally for the Taliban. They didn't necessarily have to ban political parties or push people to exile, but the security situation that developed forced a lot of people to flee the country in fear of their own lives, and they since then haven't been able to come back to the country. So the Taliban basically achieved a political cleanse and a political monopoly on power by just taking over militarily as well. But that also led to an extreme brain drain within the country, which meant that people that were not as privileged as me, people that did not have a partial safety net that I enjoyed by virtue of belonging to the family that I did, weren't safe enough to stay in the country or could not get employment within the country. I was a lecturer who wasn't paid for 7 months, right? Because the universities did not have money to give. And that's a very funny conversation to have with a dean when you call them asking them for your pay and they tell you they don't have money to give you, right? And you keep working because you're a good guy and everyone abuses the good guy. But also, beyond this political monopoly and cleanse, something that happens with military takeovers is that the established norms and laws go away, right? What does that mean? That means that you have a constitution. The constitution eventually is made out of laws that protect you, but you don't always need written laws because very often your state communicates with you norms which are treatments and behaviors that you expect or are expected of you. Now, when a whole new regime comes and takes power and you don't have laws, laws take time to build, but you require norms to at least understand what to do, which means that when I come to demonstrate in front of your building asking for my rights, when there are no norms, anything can happen, and especially when you're faced with an insurgency that is very trigger happy, that means your political options are very limited with regards to your activism. So this is just a quick recap of what had happened and how we arrived to where we arrived. And right now then we are in a very unpleasant status quo, and that status quo includes quite a few things. For those of you who have read about Afghanistan, we were promised that girls' high schools would be open a few weeks ago. As the start of the new school term was happening, we had girls who showed up to school, and an hour later, the education ministry sent a directive asking them to go back home because the ban was still in place. So children came back home crying. We had basically the whole nation's heart broke because of such a decision. That being said, we have to understand a few things. And important amongst them is that we're coming out of a 20-year war, right? And if you read literature by people like Archetti and others who look at intractable conflicts, and those are conflicts that have lasted 20 years or more, they require narratives, they require stories. Because remember, if you absent-mindedly are doing something and sometimes you ask yourself, why am I doing this, right? Or why did I start doing this? And that's how conflicts work. People at some point ask themselves why they're doing what they're doing. So you have to constantly enforce and reinforce their actions by giving them a narrative and a story. Meaning, when the first generation is fighting, it still makes sense because they remember the grievances that pushed them towards armed conflict. But the second generation needs a newer narrative that is one they can relate to. And these conflicts keep on evolving. And part of this evolution of the narrative is a constant othering of your opponent. What does that mean? That means when you're asking one of your suicide bombers or the attack on the hotel that we just mentioned to go in and cause a large collateral, your conscience is not going to allow you to do so. But then you can override that by saying that, well, these people, by virtue of accepting a godless order, are already morally moral criminals, and they deserve the treatment that they get, right? And that necessarily works when you're fighting, but it's not just the Taliban that did that. The othering is done on both ends, because the Taliban weren't an alien entity. They weren't someone who crossed the border into our country to fight us. Because if they were, they wouldn't have been able to sustain themselves for 20 years. They wouldn't have been able to find as much footing as they did within the country. So the Taliban are a mere symptom of a larger problem. And the problem was always that whatever development happened within Afghanistan was always within the urban centers, and it never trickled down to the rural population. The rural population only saw detentions, they saw night raids, they saw their own human security being violated, which gave them more and more reasons to join insurgencies such as the Taliban, right? When your basic needs are not met, it means that you have less to lose, which makes you desperado. And that means you're willing to join movements that are willing to go to the extreme end. There's a very famous quote by Sun Tzu where he says, if a man carries his sword and walks into the marketplace and he challenges anyone and everyone he meets to a fight till death, if no one fights him, I would not call the man brave, nor would I call the people cowards, because the man is a desperado and he has nothing to lose, right? And that is the reality that we created. And right now, in Afghanistan, we have a political monopoly of the Taliban. They have created an interim government, an interim cabinet that is made out of 100% Taliban and 100% men. And they have promised that they would come up with something more inclusive, but we are yet to see developments on that end. We also see the Taliban turn more and more towards their deep state, and their counter-terrorism strategies are becoming more and more dangerous, where the intelligence sector walks into media outlets. They have taken away journalists, they have taken away civil activists, many of whom are still abducted and missing. We see a shrinking role for women within public spaces and civil society. And I know I sound very doom and gloom right now, but we're going to talk about what can be done. But we cannot solve the issue unless we acknowledge the issue to being as drastic as it is. And look, one of the major issues, and this is something that you guys would have been exposed to, is the libertarian thought of how much influence the state should have in your lives, right? And we know that the idea of taxation and welfare is problematic because you say, why does the government have to say so much about how I spend my money? And then beyond that, any regulation that they put on your life. And the problem is, the more autocratic regimes become, the more they start violating your private sphere and enlarging their own public sphere, which means that they start telling you things about how you should dress, what you should look like, and so on and so forth. And that ends up requiring a lot of micro-policing, which in turn requires a lot of more force, and the vicious cycle continues. So that is another reality within Afghanistan, where the private sphere is shrinking, and a lot more, especially because we have a ministry that is called the Ministry of promoting virtue and preventing vice. And I know it sounds like a Harry Potter ministry, but they are designed to be on the road and prevent people and police people's behavior. And that has become a bane of the current system. And there's very little tolerance for dissent. People like myself, who have constantly preached for reconciliation and even tolerance towards the idea of coexistence even before the fall of Kabul, are people whose opinions are not tolerated within Afghanistan, because anything that is not state-sanctioned is not worth being out there to begin with. And lastly, we have a huge issue of freedom of speech, because part of autocratic regimes is that there is supposed to be a media crackdown. And a lot of these issues come from the way that the Taliban fighters have envisioned Afghanistan to be for the past 20 years. Because remember that narrative and story that I told you that's important to keep you fighting? That also included telling your fighters that everything about the previous system was wrong, which meant that every positive thing about the system was more of a Western idea than it was an Afghan idea. So today, when we talk about rights for women, or when we talk about things like pluralism within the political system, or when we talk about media being more free in the country, we are told that these ideas are all Western ideals and democracy in itself is Western, whereas we have to keep telling them that political participation or democracy doesn't necessarily have to be a Western ideal. And one of the major reasons that the Taliban could maximize on this narrative was because we kept calling the gains of the past 20 years within Afghanistan as a Western and liberal achievement, which meant that inalienable rights that Afghans should have had today are being taken away because they were supposedly Western imposed ideas. So we have to keep countering that narrative. Now, the important idea before we even talk about how we are going to deal with the Taliban, considering all of the background that I just gave you and the preface that now you have, is, how do you view the Taliban? Are we going to view the Taliban in the binary of friend or foe? Does that help? Because there's an important question of the evil that is involved. And I recently wrote a piece for Responsible Statecraft in which I said the Taliban are not an absolute evil, they are just another less than ideal entity ruling a country. Right? And that statement was very controversial to a lot of people. And though the target audience for this statement was the international community, we choose to engage with countries like China that are committing religious genocide. We choose to engage with Russia for the longest of times, considering their human rights abuse. Bashar al-Assad is now a more tolerable tyrant to exist in the world. So we deal with such levels of evil. Mohammed bin Salman has investments within your country, within the media of your country. He butchers people in consulates of Turkey, and that is fine, but somehow the Taliban are the worst thing that could have ever happened to the world. So we will choose to not engage with the Taliban or sanction the whole of Afghanistan and cause the largest humanitarian crisis in modern history, right? So there is a certain hypocrisy there. And obviously, with everything that I have told you, we cannot assume that the Taliban are saints or that they are not evil or the actions that they are doing are not evil. But that being said, if we're going to listen to people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, who have led movements of reconciliation and the creation or synthesizing two very different visions of the world into one more sustainable society, then we will understand that at the core of any reconciliation is to not consider the person evil, but consider their actions to be evil. Because the moment you start hating the person you are engaging with, the whole idea of engaging with them becomes morally deplorable to begin with. Does that make sense to everyone? So the idea of, at the core of reconciliation, is to humanize your opponent, to be worth engaging with. And that's where the idea of the absolute evil concept comes in, because once you start viewing someone as an absolute evil, all means of engagement or ways of engagement close down. And there are definitions of obviously what absolute evil is. Absolute evil is more systemic when it's aimed at larger war crimes in a more systemic fashion. That being said, you have people like Hannah Arendt who look at totalitarianism or absolute evil as something that is more there is a banality to it, so it's very meaningless. It isn't part of a grand scheme. You're just evil because I just feel like being evil, right? It doesn't have to be a plan or a scheme. So there are different schools of thought. But there's also the important idea of, are the Taliban terrorists, right? And the problem is the term terrorist and terrorism are very subjective terms that have always been thrown around a lot. And God bless George W. Bush, who ended up abusing that term after 2001, where the war on terror was introduced, which was something that was not a norm, international norm, where you cannot declare war against a concept, especially if it is a genuine military campaign. We can say we have a war on smoking, but that would necessarily include soft policies in which you discourage people from smoking. But once you send your troops to fight a concept, it becomes far more complicated. But it's not just about whether the Taliban are committing actions of terrorists. When we ask ourselves as to whether the Taliban are terrorists now, it's really important because it dictates the way we negotiate and engage with them. What does that mean? Remember the statement you hear in movies that says, we don't negotiate with terrorists? But you do. Because a lot of times when hostage situations happen, you have a specialist who comes in and makes a call, and you would have seen enough movies about it that a negotiation goes forth and eventually people are released. But that being said, there is the idea of absolute terrorists as well. What that means is when I have a suicide vest on, the moment I put that vest on, my life ended. There is nothing in this world that you can offer me to stop myself from blowing myself up, which means that I am not a rational actor to engage with or negotiate with to begin with, right? Because I have achieved that absolute desperado state and nothing is going to sway me from it. That being said, academics and theorists say that we very often get so bogged down in the absolute terrorist nature of the suicide bomber that we forget that the leadership of such movements are still rational actors who are willing to trade in for specific political wins and advantages. That means that the Taliban movement, despite having used tactics such as suicide bombing, at the core of them is a leadership that is willing to negotiate and horse trade for specific political privileges. And do we have free will? Do you guys think we have free will? Are you free? Do you have free will? Yeah.
How do you define free will?
Let's just say, did you have a choice in the tie that you wore?
Yes.
Are you sure? Is it yours?
That's a good question. I mean, I just thought it looked the best for this outfit. So.
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? You woke up in the morning on a specific side of your bed with a specific schedule to entertain, which meant that you had the debate today, which meant that you had to wear a tie, which meant that your friend luckily had a tie on him that you took, or for example, which means a lot of times the decisions that you think that you're making are just selecting between very limited options that you have. And the more you read about the chemistry of the brain, the more you know that if I ask you to name a random number, your brain already decides that number close to a second before you've actually decided that number, right? So your chemical equations within your head are making decisions for you. Your circumstances are making decisions for you. The clothes you're wearing today are being chosen by the weather, by the economy, by the system that you live in, right? And this is not to say that you don't have free will, because if I ask you to raise a random hand, you can still choose to raise a random hand. But that being said, you are all a product of your environments, right? And this determinism helps because very often there is a very famous murder incident within the United States where two random robbers walked into a house, tied a mother and a daughter, and eventually figured out that the cops were coming, and in a split second they turned around, they lit the mother and daughter on fire and walked out. When they were asked why they made that last decision, they didn't know. They just made that decision, right? So we can start hating, and this is me quoting Sam Harris's essay, by the way, before you think this is just me saying it, but there's a very good essay by Sam Harris on free will. It's very short, so take a look at it. And they say that they just made that decision on the go. And it's not to say that it's justified because it was just a random spur of the moment decision, but it helps us in designing systems that aren't meant to punish these people, but to understand that their decisions are a result of their environments, and we start working on those environments to rehabilitate people. Now, keeping that in mind, and keeping the whole preface and context that I gave you of the Taliban in mind, when I see the Taliban, when I interact with them, I do understand that the reason they are who they are is the environment that all of us played a role in creating, including you and your governments, right? Including me and my personal choices. I could have very easily been the Taliban fighter that I was shaking hands with, because I grew up in a very religious household. I grew up seeing the United States taking my father away, him spending 6.5 years in American detention, him being put through the learned helplessness program that was sanctioned by the CIA, which included burying people alive, right? Tell that to an 11-year-old boy who knows that's what is happening to their father. Tell that to a boy whose cousins are dying in Afghanistan because of bombs on which Americans have written down their names. Our children in Afghanistan were dying to bombs that were like souvenirs being sent out from the US, right? So whatever Afghanistan we arrived at was a result of very bad policies, both on Afghan parts and the international community's parts. Which is why when I say that the Taliban are a symptom of a larger problem, I believe that the solution isn't to dispose of the Taliban from leadership at whatever cost it may be. It is about working at the grassroots level to change Afghanistan and change the larger Afghan society so that we stop having groups come up like the Taliban. Right? And there is a lot of literature with regards to that as well. So considering the circumstances that we are facing, we have to make a very difficult choice. And we've had to make these choices for months now. When Kabul fell, I was live on BBC with Yalda Hakim, and she asked me what I thought, and I told her that I know that people were worried, but we needed to understand that the only thing that had changed was that wall had come down, and now we were face to face with each other. And our choices today were going to decide how we move forward. Now, the situation isn't ideal. It would be hypocritical of me to say right now that let's accept Taliban as they are a reality, let's deal with it. There are problems, fundamental problems. And because any sustainable order, one of the major criticisms of ideologies like Marxism or any other revolutionary idea you can come up with is that it never talks about what it will do to the other. We want to overthrow the bourgeoisie, but we don't know what to do with them because it's not like they will disappear. Right? So a system that is designed to completely cut out the other is not sustainable. So if the Taliban think that the people who have bigger aspirations for Afghanistan can be locked out, they're wrong. And we need to push them to realize that. And that means when an opponent comes to power who doesn't acknowledge you as a viable partner or viable opponent to respect and to interact, engage with, that means you force them to do so. What does that mean? That means when you're doing fundamental work, which includes creating spaces, you go into public discourse, you go into providing services that the state is failing to provide, including aid, you eventually become Afghans and individuals that the Taliban are forced to acknowledge and deal with. And we have already achieved that bit. Then the second part is to put our nonviolent political action into motion. Right? Which means that you understand that military conflict or violent resistance is not the solution. Because there's a very interesting idea that every group that has ever wanted a revolution says that they're having the revolution to change the system and the world. But every one of them, when they get to the top of the system, forget about the major goal, which was to change the system, right? So everyone wants a revolution, but no one knows what to do the morning after. So, which is why nonviolent political action is fundamental, because it not only resists the Taliban and pushes them to change policies to accommodate Afghans and their aspirations for their lives, but it is also about changing the lives of the larger Afghan population. Because Gandhi used to say in his Satyagraha, says that it is not just about ousting the tiger, it is about ousting the spirit of the tiger. That means that unless you can change the larger ideology and thinking, and very fundamental to the thinking of Gandhi with regards to nonviolent action was that there has to be community level change. So without community empowerment, you can never change the tyrannical rules that rule you. And which means that we start working towards a more localized peace. Afghanistan can find a political system that doesn't need to be Western. Afghanistan can find a peace that is localized and designed to it. Those of you who are studying peace would already know that there are so many cultures out there in the world, including specific distinct cultures within Africa, in which when a murder is committed, the whole spirit of the tribe is in trouble and in congruence. And they eventually come together and they share a meal from a bowl together, and that's when the two families eventually bond. So human beings have different ways of reconciling, and as long as we don't recognize that, as long as it is always about imposed solutions on a very distinct people, it's never going to be sustainable. That being said, nothing is going to change without large-scale mobilization within Afghanistan, because I am just one person. I might have 100, 1,000 people who want the solution that I seek, but as long as the larger population doesn't want it, even nonviolent action is not sustainable. What does that mean? When the Taliban reverse the ban on the girls' school and reimpose it, if we had a few thousand parents come out to the roads, because they can arrest one, they can abduct 10, they can shoot at 100, but they cannot do that to 1,000 people on the road. Because once you start cracking down on 1,000 people, you are causing an uprising yourself. But the problem is that Afghans have spent the past 40 years caught up in such intricate webs of violence that they don't know the power of political and nonviolent mobilization. And we have to teach that to the larger population. I am being mindful of time because I want to interact with you guys as well, and I have questions in the end. So we still want a democratic Afghanistan. We haven't given up on that. And our democracy might not look very Western, but it's going to be something that is sustainable. It is going to be something that reflects the will of the people. It is going to be something that has pluralism in it, right? And we have to work towards that. And there are steps to that. I've actually written pieces, and my journal publication is going to come out soon with regards to how we view a process of democratizing Afghanistan. And that includes, political parties left the country, the Taliban don't want them back. How do we make the Taliban want them back? One solution is the international community or the US turns around and says, I will not engage with you unless you make this person sit across the table with you. That sounds good in theory, but that makes the other person sound like a stooge to the United States and a foreign agent, right? But then a more viable solution is, because the Taliban lacks so many tools of governance, when Afghan politicians and political entities show themselves as viable interlocutors between them and the international community, or them and the larger Afghan population, they become indisposable, indispensable to the Taliban, and the Taliban are forced to recognize them as political partners. There is always going to be a power asymmetry. One thing that we Afghans know, and we wish the international community realizes as well, is that ideal solutions in Afghanistan right now are not going to be ideal, because the Taliban, being a religious group that has won or come to power through a total victory, they're going to want to monopolize everything. So right now, we have to negotiate on the margins. We have to settle for whatever marginal benefit and breathing space that we can get. And those are very difficult moral questions as well. And I'm going to pose them to you in the end. So the international community, what can it do for Afghanistan right now? As Professor Moosa already mentioned, one of the things that is important is the Afghan population is suffering due to the sanctions. We have $9 billion in foreign reserves that are kept in the United States banks that have been frozen since August. This fund or these assets are super important for an economy to sustain the rate of their currency, and that has a huge impact on your economy as a whole. We do understand that the Taliban are not a legitimate government of Afghanistan, and these funds should not be handed over completely to the Taliban, but you don't have to be stuck between the binaries of let's make everyone starve to let's give all the money to the Taliban. There's a huge range of options in the middle. This can be a phased-wise release. This can be an informal release done to specific bodies within Afghanistan that can handle these funds, even if private banks and so on and so forth. But we really need to break out of that. So the funds are really important. The international community, the analogy that I like to give is this. We're playing a game of cards. The Taliban are sitting on one side and Afghans are sitting on the other side, non-Taliban Afghan. And then you have the international community standing behind us. The Taliban have cards in their hands. The Afghan community has nothing in their hands. The international community has all the cards that we were supposed to hold. So complementarity is very important. The international community has to complement the efforts of Afghans who are trying to achieve a political order and push and demand their rights. And also the international community can help reestablish certain norms within Afghanistan with regards to how dissent is handled, what the crackdowns on demonstrations are supposed to look like, what women activists, how they should be dealt with or not dealt with at all, are important questions that the international community can address. That being said, I wanted to pose a few questions to you, and hopefully we can get a conversation going. So I don't know how many of you have read about nonviolent resistance and what it looks like, because there are a few important thinkers. Gene Sharp has 198 methods of nonviolent resistance, and those include protests and boycotts and civil disobedience and so on and so forth. Does it work? Do you think that nonviolent action always works, especially when you're faced with a violent opponent? Do you think that, so for example, yes, there are governments in Europe that changed because one day people decided to drive slower than the speed required of them. When you have that sort of systems, yes, very minor civil disobediences end up giving results. But do you think civil disobedience works across the table? What would you say to an argument? Sorry, who? Oh, yeah. I think I'm supposed to give you a mic when you're, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say, I think it depends on how brutal the regime is. So, for example, in the Gambia, where there was 22 years of dictatorship, sorry. So, for example, in the Gambia, where there was 22 years of dictatorship, people did try non-violent action, but at what cost? So, yeah, I think it can work, but then it really does depend on how brutal a regime is.
Okay, counter question. Some people say that, those who are unfamiliar with nonviolent action would tell you, you think nonviolence always works, tell that to the Ukrainians. What would you think of that argument? Do you think nonviolence works when your country is invaded? You can't necessarily ask, what was that Ridge movie in which that guy refuses to carry a gun? It's a very nice movie. You guys should watch it. Huh? Hacksaw Ridge, yeah. But at the end of the day, you have to understand that there's a distinction. When a foreign aggressor invades your country, you are obviously expected to stand up and militarily resist, right? But when we talk about nonviolent action, it is always internal to your government. And yes, there are cases where nonviolent action has not worked. Yet there are cases of nonviolent action in Latin America where autocracies and despots that have been in power for decades had mothers come out and protest within the plaza, which eventually led to revolutions and changes of regime. So we have to, a central tenet of nonviolent action, and this is something that the Kingsian 6 principles really do cover, is nonviolent action only works when you believe to your core that justice is going to prevail, because it's going to be a very difficult decision to make. And trust me, every day when we have to make that decision again, after seeing newer and more brutal policies from the Taliban, it takes a piece of our soul, because it makes more sense to face violence with violence, to fight off oppression. But it's more difficult to choose the longer way forward, which is going to be something more sustainable in the end.
I think you mentioned, I think you specifically referenced. Thank you. I think you specifically referenced the grandmothers and mothers of La Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, I think. Yeah. I think that the difference between that and obviously the Afghanistan conflict is that those women, like you said, truly believed that not only their own country would back them, but that the international community would recognize the extent of the damage that that conflict was causing, because it is Argentina, and that is a completely different situation to the international community than Afghanistan would be. So just...
Actually, what is interesting is that the Mothers of the Plaza model was implemented in Afghanistan a few times as well, and successfully to that measure. At the time when all of that was happening, you had Reaganomics in full action, Thatcherism was in full action, so no one really cared for people in Latin America as well as to what they would achieve. It's just that there's a certain sanctity of motherhood that is very useful. And this is just to show you that there are so many tools available in such extreme environments where your opponent is very trigger happy. One of the discussions that I had to have with experts of nonviolent action at the beginning of the fall was a lot of women were organizing to protest, and I knew that the numbers weren't large enough to make much of a difference, and they were exposing themselves to danger. Is, as a nonviolent actor, if you know that your opponent is going to be violent in reaction to what you're doing, are you still being nonviolent? What do you guys think? So for example, you're saying, I'm not going to hurt anyone, but you know going out there is going to start a brawl. Even if you don't hit anyone, but someone is going to get hurt. Because your nonviolence isn't necessarily about you not punching, it's about not causing harm, right? So are you responsible? Is it nonviolent when you know for a fact that the reaction to your action is going to be violent? What do you guys think? Since you have a debate soon, so I think you should be entertaining critical ideas.
I would love to talk about that.
Yeah.
I think, I'm not sure my perspective on that right now, but my question to that would be, or my qualification to that would be, when is the line for when you know your actions are going to cost something? Like, for example, if I do something that I know is going to cause someone to do something else, which is going to cause them to do something, which will cause them to do something, which will cause violence, what degree of separation is there going to be? Because you can't consider you'll be paralyzed if you keep trying to consider too far into the future. So I'm just curious what the line is in terms of degrees of separation.
Okay, so
Fabrice is trying to get away
yeah.
into the back. No, you can answer
Fine,
it.
we can compound both questions together.
I was just gonna say, I feel like the line is separated in terms of like, if your intent is to cause like violence, like, so I think if you come in and violence is gonna be the byproduct, but you're ultimately standing what you believe in, then I think having that threat of violence is okay. But if your intention is to like cause a riot, if you're going in like, oh, hey, this is gonna, be publicized, so we're gonna go in, we're gonna like have them hit us, I feel like that's where that line is kind of crossed. So I feel like going in, knowing what you're doing is right, I feel like that's like the separator for me, at least.
Okay, the interesting bit is just a quick bit of foreign policy as well. When the Cuban Missile Crisis was happening, a very important decision made on the United States' part was based on the rational actor model, where a lot of the things that they were deciding to do were all done considering what reaction they would get from Russia if they do so. Right? So you are, to a certain extent, responsible for the reaction to your actions as well. But that being said, I don't think that there is a specific line that is drawn that you should know these lines will keep evolving and redefining themselves. So based on your context, you will have to make a cost-benefit analysis of whether you going out and the violence that you face and the cost of life that might happen, are you willing to take that moral responsibility? Is it good enough for you to achieve your goals or move towards them? And these are important decisions to be had. And then beyond that, I already talked about negotiating on the margins and compromises. A very important question that haunts me and a lot of people who are engaging with the Taliban and trying to have a dialogue with them with regards to civil liberties and rights is, how much do you compromise on? What is your red line, right? So we figured that closing high schools for girls was a red line. But when they said that they had to put a barrier between university classes where both genders would be segregated, we said, all right, that's a compromise we're willing to make as long as you let the woman come to university and study, right? But then they said, women are not allowed in the mosques. And that's a religious argument as well that engaged, and you're like, okay, I don't know if we're supposed to accept it or not. Am I the right person to accept it or not? As a man, as someone who is not representative of the larger population, is it okay for me to have that conversation? Is it okay or morally okay for me to have a different tone when I sit with the Taliban? Right? Because a demand of me is when I approach the Taliban, I have to have a reconciliatory tone, even if I find their actions deplorable, right? And then you have to ask yourself, are you a morally correct person to sit there and be more so accepting of them in a situation where they would have killed so many people and this many bad things have happened? These are important questions to ask, and there's a very fine line between appeasing the oppressor and opposing the oppressor. And because when you're choosing nonviolent action, you're trying to push the regime to change, but you're also willing to operate from within the system. And knowing that there is very little tolerance for dissent and counter opinion, you have to be very mindful of your steps. A very simple dilemma is, since the Taliban came to power, they have shut down dozens of TV and radio networks. Yet there are some very large media outlets that are still operating within the country. But they're operating under the rules and regulations that the Taliban have set. Do you think that morally, they should turn around to the Taliban and say, if you don't let me operate as freely as I'm supposed to, I will shut down and leave and lose all shot at free media in the future in Afghanistan? Or do you think that they should accept limitations and cover as much as they can? Would you settle for the lesser evil or the lesser good? If you were the head of this TV network, what would you do? Considering that you're probably the last voice of the voiceless.
That's a good question. I'm sure the class, yes.
Well, personally, I think I would, like, right now, like how the Taliban is, like, just like as hostile as it is, I would settle, because like you want like the people to like get as much like of that free will that is like, I guess, given out as they can, and like try to like learn as much as they can from like the outside world. But I think like as if like more people like like I guess like form like more of a movement and like have more of a voice, then I think they should like go against the Taliban and like protest for a more like free will and more free will like in terms of like
And
TV.
settle for the limited amount of information that they have. How do other people think about it? Camilla. Is it only Camilla and 3 people going to be participating? Yes, Audrey? Okay, good.
But just very quickly, I think that like the idea, the situation that you've presented is a perfect example of the only thing that we really have to deal with as alternatives in that moment. There's usually only 2 options that are really valid. In this situation, it's a perfect example of how you would have to like have moral concessions in order to continue on the path towards a goal. And I think if I were in charge of the social media company that is doing that, I would definitely think that my priority would be to hold out for the people of Afghanistan having that freedom someday, then because I am so morally offended by the Taliban and all of their values that I would just pull out and abandon the situation completely. I think that you have to consider it as what is the best option in this moment for the people that are being oppressed.
But also, while that is being entertained, and I'd want you to touch upon this point, is are you in the position to make that decision as well, right? Because right now, being that in charge of that media outlet, you are making a decision that is going to affect the lives of millions of Afghans, right? So do you give yourself that agency of saying, well, I'm settling for this and doing that because it's for the longer term good, right? Am I right in sitting down across the Taliban and having a conversation with regards to women's rights, knowing that the women are never going to be in the short term put on that table to express themselves? Should I be giving myself that right to have that conversation in their stead?
Well, I think that sometimes the most moral thing that you can do is accept that you have to do something that makes you uncomfortable, but is for the greatest good. And I think in that case, that's what a compromise is. Even if you individually have trouble sleeping at night knowing that you're conceding to the Taliban, at least you know that other people might have a future of free media in the future. And so I think that in that way, morality can be very complex because it's not just an individual matter about what your conscience feels. You have to take into account the greater good, and that might include sacrificing how you feel about yourself to an extent.
Okay, interesting. And we had someone who had a remark from there, but I want you to think about this other dilemma as well. And the dilemma is, imagine that women are locked out of society. We've banned them from school. We've banned them from public spaces. We've banned them from work. And they can't come out and protest. The society is built in a way where women cannot mobilize at a large scale. As men, would you come out and protest? And obviously there's comfort in numbers when you think that, okay, I'll come out and there'll be another 1 million men, so we'll hopefully get our way. I want you to think about it in a way where there's a very high probability that there's just going to be a handful of you, and you are probably going to be abducted and would probably be tortured and killed for that demonstration. Would you demonstrate? Right? And I also want you to think about how we approach climate change in the same equation, because you don't switch off your light because you're like, well, it's just one light. I don't think I'm causing the glaciers to melt, right? But you don't realize that as a compound, you can all come together. And here, very often, the men think that, yeah, I do understand I have to pay a large cost, but I don't really know if there is much utility in me coming out. Because there is utility in you coming out. Because if you come out and your neighbor comes out and your cousin comes out, you will eventually have the thousands that are required to push the Taliban to change policies. But as men, would you come out considering the circumstances? I think we'll take that point at the end and then come here. Do you still have a point, or do you? Okay, we'll.
So we have 2 questions online. Oh.
Okay, let's just get Ethan and then.
Yeah, 2 online questions.
Okay, perfect.
Ethan is right there.
Well, this whole dilemma kind of reminds me of a concept I learned in my management class. And like when one person steps up to be like the trendsetter, it creates a more comfortable environment for others to follow. Because it shows that someone is brave enough to express vulnerability, and that the other people that have the same view can step up in a similar way.
Would you be the trendsetter?
I mean, for an issue like this, I feel like someone has to do it. This is representing like half the whole population, you know. Since
Will you be it? Will you be the one?
Because I've had this thinking. I've actually sat down. I'll be in Kabul in 8 days. I already have death threats from the Taliban. So, and I have talked to people, and I was thinking of starting one of the first demonstrations within Kabul for girls' high schools. But then the discussion that ensued was them telling me, are you willing to pay that cost? We will lose a voice like yours to something that will not, because the assumption is that it would be a trend and people will come out and next day it will be a national revolution based on this issue. But what if they take me away and nothing happens? Is that price worth paying?
That's a good question, and keeping it rhetorically, we got two online. We don't ignore the two online questions. There are people online. Can you just
yeah, I'll give them the mic.
say it, Sophia?
So the first question is, what are the cards that the international community hold, and what should they ask from the Taliban in return? And do you think that the Taliban is ready to compromise on the fundamentals?
On the what?
Compromise on the fundamentals.
Taliban, are they prepared to compromise on the fundamentals? And the other one was,
what leverages do the international community?
What leverage does the international community have?
So the international community has a lot of leverages. Shocking news. Do you know after Russia invaded Ukraine, the sanctions put on them are lesser than the sanctions on Afghanistan? Afghanistan has its SWIFT blocked. For the life of it, the United States and its allies did not want to block the SWIFT transactions for Russia, right? Our federal assets are seized. That's not something that is happening to Russia. So considering that the international community has a lot of leverage with regards to Afghanistan, our foreign federal reserves is one, the blacklisting and the movement of the Taliban leadership is another that they can use when they start. That's why, so look, there's a lot of literature about sanctions, and it says that sanctions don't work, only the threat of sanctions work. Because once you put sanctions, it doesn't really achieve anything. I mean, you put sanctions on all of Afghanistan thinking that the starving population is going to stand up and push the government to change policies. And that government didn't get elected. It's not like we can use our votes to change government. They're here by force. The only difference that it made was, now I'm hungry, right? And there's this quotation that says, empty bellies don't think about revolutions. Right? And you literally took away the one thing that could have pushed, and obviously there's a counter quotation to that says, empty bellies think of nothing but revolution, but that's an argument for another day. So the idea is you could tailor those sanctions to specifically the Taliban leadership to limit their movement, to limit their properties, seize their assets outside Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, rather than making the larger population suffer. That was the leverages point. The other question was?
Do you think the Taliban is ready or willing?
Yeah, so fundamentals, right? So there, if you read work by Zartman and others that concern themselves with dialogue, they tell you that there are very often sacred values. What that means is when I'm negotiating with you, there are specific things about me that define me. So I'm going to be willing to trade in a lot of things, but I will not trade in the things that make me who I am. And that isn't not necessarily because, oh, I don't want to betray my true nature, but it's because as a movement and organization, when you start betraying your nature, you start losing your fighters. There's another issue and dilemma in Afghanistan right now where the Taliban are faced with the threat of ISK, which is the Islamic State of Khorasan in Afghanistan. the ISIS version of Afghanistan. And the problem there is that every time the Taliban take a policy measure that isn't in line with the hardline thinking that they came to power with, they lose their fighters to a group that is much more radical, which is called ISK, right? So that's where the fundamental and the sacred values negotiation comes in. But there's still a lot of room to discuss quite a few things, even if we don't touch at the core of it. There are ways the policies are implemented that are open to discussion.
I'm just mindful of time. Some of you have to go to our next class, so I want you to all share with, thank Professor Obaidullah for this. But those of you who have to go can go, but we have another 15 minutes for those who want to stay and have a conversation. We can continue that, and even the people online, we can continue that. Please help me to thank Professor Obaidullah.
Please feel free to follow my work. I'm on Twitter. I put a lot of my written content there as well. So hopefully we can stay in touch there and follow each other's work.
Thank you. But some of us are going to stay behind and we're going to talk. We'll continue the conversation. Yeah, if you have to go, if you have to go. Yes.
Sorry, can I ask a really quick question?
Yeah.
Just personally?
Yeah.
I'm zooming, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Hey.
I'm taking a class on civil wars.
Is it okay?
Civil wars, and one of the issues that we've been grappling with has been what causes armed actors to act the way they do, and how do they sustain those? Like, how do they sustain them? And one of the things we've been talking about is how much of it is like religious, ethnic, those divides versus how much of it is grievances like poverty, etc.
If you don't have a class, you want to stay behind, stay for the conversation.
I'd have almost joined the Taliban or fighters because you grew up in that.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering how, in your experience, how much of it is actually like religious grievances versus like.
It's always.
So can you sit down, or if you have to leave, maybe you can answer the question for the best.
Yeah, so it's an interesting discussion. The discussion is how often is it actual grievances, how much of it is religious and ideological, and know that both of them aren't very different things. The only thing that is different is your ideology sort of skews your grievances because they become less tangible and less physical. What that means is you don't necessarily have to have strict violations of. So let's just say there's a very specific model of when you talk or engage in peace settlements is when you realize that your current state isn't good, it's not getting any better, you're like, let's settle, right? But the problem is the cost of war is very skewed when you're looking at it from an ideological lens, because you don't look at how many tanks and rifles you have. You say, I have this many Valkyries that are going to come down and support my forces, right? Which changes things quite a bit. So your grievances, your sense of your scale, gauging your grievances changes when ideology is involved, but it's always going to be grievances that are making those decisions for you. Yeah, you're welcome.
We have one more question online.
Yeah.
So the person would like to know your views on hypothesizing Taliban as a peasant's phenomenon through emphasis in academic analysis.
Sorry?
Taliban as a, how do you analyze the Taliban as a peasant phenomenon, and how does that factor into academic analysis as a peasantry, that the Taliban is a peasantry? I know Fabrice has a question. And any one of you, Sid has a question.
Yeah, sure. Go.
I was just wondering, like, when you're talking about like alternatives, like basically, like the only, like you only have alternatives. What it seems like in Afghanistan. So how do you expect to improve like the well-being of these people when you're only dealing with alternatives?
Look, there's a thing about algorithms. It's called NP-complete problems. There are specific problems that don't have a perfect solution, right? And in them, you have to always choose your Occam's razor. So you choose the best possible solution, right? It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to address the problem completely, but you choose whatever works best for now. So our goal should always be long-term. And Afghanistan does not have a short-term solution. Silver bullets would not work. The magic app will not solve Afghanistan's crisis. So we have to figure out, deal with the alternatives for now, create spaces for ourselves, mobilize the dissent, and then once that dissent has mobilized and formalized as political oppositions to the Taliban, only then can we demand realer and larger things. So it's not short term, it's just going to take quite a bit.
So it's like, in a sense, a long-term
Yeah, it's a grassroots revolution. So unless things change, unless community-based changes happen, unless Afghans know what their rights are, unless Afghans stand up as a large mobilized society for what they believe in, we're just going to keep on having the issues that we've had for the past 40 years.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So thank you so much for speaking with us today. I was just wondering, when you go back to Afghanistan, first, like, are you worried about like the outcomes? Yeah, like your security, and like of like how your family interacts with that, and also like what do you like hope to like achieve like when you like go back and like I guess that first like few weeks?
Well, one of the things that I keep telling people is that I take calculated risks, but boy, am I bad at math. So I'm hoping that this is a calculated risk. The problem is that there's a very large rogue behavior within the movement. So their modus operandi isn't to give out your name and sanction a team to come and get you, but they start putting out content. Every one of my tweets, every one of my pieces is translated and circulated within their circles, which necessarily creates grievances in which someone will randomly come and take you out. So there's always that fear, but nothing in life comes cheap. That being said, I'm hoping to go back and work on my aid initiatives. We've fed quite a few thousand families. We've done $100,000 and more of work so far. We're going to start microfinancing small loans to families to start businesses. So there's that. There's also political ends to meet with different Taliban leaders and try to convince them to have a tad bit more rationality with regards to we don't want Afghanistan to go back into war. So we've achieved war. We still haven't achieved peace. And then even within peace, we are currently, if we were in a peace, it would be a negative peace because it's just the absence of violence. And positive peace is when you genuinely have your rights guaranteed. So we have to push towards that phase.
Okay. Yeah, my question kind of ties into that. And the question you posed about, once having that trendsetter and like having people come out, to what extent do you think that, so I'm trying to think, do you think to a large extent it depends on like having someone from like the community, someone from the country, that Gandhi of India, that Martin Luther for like African Americans? Do you think that has a much more powerful impact than, let's say, like someone from the West comes out to speak on women attending schools in Afghanistan? Like, do you?
Well, the role of a prophetic voice.
Yeah. So, but the problem is, where does the prophet come from? Does the prophet create the community and change, or does the change and community create the prophet? It's the egg and the chicken equation all over again, right? Was Gandhi a result of the movement, or was the movement a result of Gandhi?
No, Desmond Tutu.
The question was more on, do you think, I'm assuming.
The other part of his question was, do you need, is it the outside, must the outsider create the Gandhi?
No, is it much more, because you talk about like having, like, are you still willing to go out if, you're going to get abducted, tortured, and killed? Like are you being afraid of maybe like you dying and nothing else happening after that? Do you think you're much more resolved to do and have a hope of like future change taking place if you're from that community? If you're like I'm personally from Rwanda and I'm like, so I can't change. So like, do you think people would be more responsive if it's a Rwandan and people are more responsive? Okay, he's a trendsetter, he's from Rwanda, then let's say someone from the US comes in and is abducted. Do you think that plays a much larger role?
So we have studies, we have science that already proves that imagined communities, meaning if you call yourself a Manchester United fan, you're creating an imagined community where you belong to those people. they only accept information, or they're more likely to accept information from people that belong to that imagined community. So very rarely will you take something from outsiders. So which is why at times it's also important to show the Taliban that unlike the demonizing image they had built of everyone who wasn't a Taliban, Afghans are the same as them. We do believe in the same principles, and sort of find that common ground with them. Then we start communicating to them our aspirations. So there has to be, the othering has to be countered. Some humanizing has to happen as well. And it happens on both ends. Like the Taliban have to take steps as well for us to arrive at a point where that communication can be useful. Until then, we keep pushing them to force them to come to that point where they start acknowledging us and interacting with us.
Ethan, and then we have 3 questions online.
Okay.
All right, so I find it interesting how you discussed the solution to all this, like with the grassroots movements in the communities and the creation of an Afghan government, an Afghan peace, and with all these values. What would this look like? Would it be, how different would it be from a traditional Western-style democracy?
Look, what Afghanistan has had traditionally as well has been the system of jargas as well, has been something which means that tribal elders come together and they sit in a large circle and then they vote on issues and stuff. There is no tangible vision of what that looks like, but it can only be achieved if that discussion ensues. But I mean, if the goal is to have the will of the people reflected within the state, it doesn't necessarily have to be ballots. It doesn't necessarily have to be two-party systems. It doesn't necessarily have to be centralized, decentralized. So the world is open to experimenting. I mean, why are we constantly, so this is where the Westphalian models and Eurocentric models are problematic, where you keep telling the world that civilization only started when Europe decided to start it, right? The world had very complex political systems much, much before we arrived at this point. So that doesn't mean that they don't work. Just because everyone has agreed on a specific reality doesn't make it the best functioning reality. Maybe for Afghanistan another system works, but it's not going to be perfect initially. It'll find itself out. It's easier for the world to create one standard and one size fits all and be able to consume everything, because then we look at it and we say, well, it looks like us, so it must be good, right? So we don't need to make clones of systems. They can be designed for local communities.
And we have online. You taking from in the room also?
Yeah, we'll take from you too. So can we okay, go ahead.
It's actually related to this.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Sure.
You know, I was going back to your point about free will and the very, very interesting findings about how, you know, if we have free will at all, our choices are constrained. And we were applying that to the situation in Afghanistan. But also, I want you to think about, and help us think about, what if we to apply the same constraints to the international community, and particularly the United States? We have $1 trillion military budget, and we fought this war. If we accept a system different from the one we're trying to implement, it's completely unacceptable because it'll be a kind of accepting defeat. And so are the choices here also constrained by what can be permitted in order for a great power like the United States and the international community at large to save face?
I mean, this restriction of free will is so important that right now, there is such a large reputation cost associated with the United States engagement with the Taliban that Congress doesn't want to touch it. Any party that does will lose the midterm election. Biden has already probably lost Congress because of his decisions in Afghanistan. And the last word he likes to hear is the word Afghanistan in his meetings. So it just shows you that, yes, even on this end, there's a huge limitation of ideas. But what would shock you is the US establishment is very happy with the Taliban. As in minus the recent developments of the girls' school closure and so on. Before that, the United States government officials thought that most of the agreements that they had with the Taliban were met by the Taliban, which is problematic because that shows that that's why they were this close to recognizing the Taliban. Right? And that's problematic because just like the peace deal in 2020, when you sat down and cut out the Afghan Republic and had your own agreement delegitimized the Republic, you're doing that again, where you're ignoring the larger Afghan community and their concerns, and you're choosing your best way out. I mean, there's a nice saying that says the United States doesn't lose wars, it loses interest. So the United States is losing its interest in Afghanistan, and that's problematic. And they did a Saigon to us.
Saigon, that's right.
I have just a couple of questions.
3 questions.
Yeah, so the first question is, what moral justification would the US have to convince the international community that it can decide the future of the people of Afghanistan, especially after it left the country in a mess twice?
Don't decide the future for Afghanistan, right? Let Afghans decide their future. Use your leverages to complement their efforts. And that too has to happen subtly. Don't come out and say that this is the list of people I want in the cabinet, because then you are literally turning them into tokenized stooges, right? But then hear out Afghan voices, talk to the larger Afghan community, push the Taliban to sit across the table and accommodate its political opponents, right? To create some sort of political pluralism. Even if it's not ideal, at least even the existence of different political entities within Afghanistan is going to be an important seed to leave.
The second one is, what do you think about the status of the LGBT folks in Afghanistan under, Afghanistan now under the Taliban?
I mean, look, in an ideal world, we would concern ourselves with rights to such a large extent. Right now, we are at a very dangerous level of the initial post-conflict state in which more inalienable rights, and you have to understand the limitation of the Taliban and where they come from, which makes any conversation about LGBT come at a cost of a lot of other things that you have to discuss with them initially. So our priorities are very problematic, and it's all very difficult decisions that we have to make.
And the final question is, does the legacy of colonialism play a role in Afghans' responses to international interference? Are there people who are both not pro-Taliban, but also not on board with the international community's vision for Afghanistan?
I am that person. I opposed US existence. I kept asking for the United States to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan because it had become the story and the narrative for the conflict. We wanted them to leave. But that being said, we didn't want the takeover to happen the way that it did. So especially with regards to colonialism, if you read more of Foucault and understand the post-structuralist view of language and how it's used for power truth, it would show you that Afghans have been given this image, archetype of being savage warriors. Why are we savage warriors? Why are we supposed to fight every civilization, right? And we didn't create this narrative. It was created for us. The British came in, they gave us the title of being the graveyard of civilization, and so on and so forth. And these aren't good. I want to be proud of the education of my country, about its wealth, about its history, not about how brutal warriors we are, right? So we're always given these titles and labels, and we don't know it, but we're subconsciously living up to them.
And the very last question.
The very last question.
The very last is, do the new armed opposition cropping up worry you?
The new armed opposition?
Yeah, does it worry you?
Of ISIS?
I think so.
No, I think it must be talking about the Northern Resistance Front. I think that morally, it becomes very difficult for me to tell someone not to pick up their guns and fight, because the situation is dire enough to justify military action as well. But because I weigh the cost and benefits of these actions, I believe that the more sustainable solution is nonviolent action, because violent action is only going to lead to another conflict. And we have been in this vicious cycle, and this has been one lucky and unfortunate break. The Iranian president, Khomeini, had said when they had to sign the peace deal with Iraq after a brutal war, he said, "I will drink this chalice of poison that is peace," right? So the Taliban might be a chalice of poison, but it is the end of the fighting, and it is the end of the war. So let's not repeat that cycle, especially if we don't have a vision for it, especially when the leadership that stands behind a violent conflict isn't going to pay a price for that violent conflict. Just as I wouldn't ask people to go out into the streets and risk their lives against trigger-happy Taliban unless I am standing amongst them, right? So it's difficult when you don't have skin in the game.
For all those remaining here and for all our online visitors and guests, thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Obaidullah Baheer, for your wonderful and insightful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you for
our students have been enlightened, and this is a very important conversation that I hope this is only the first that you will have at University of Notre Dame. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.